You ever have someone try to pull a fast one on you, something so brazen, so utterly audacious, that for a fleeting second you almost have to tip your hat to their sheer, unadulterated gall? Yeah, that feeling lasts about as long as a snowflake on a hot griddle. Then reality kicks in, and you remember it's your property, your resources, and they're about to discover that messing with a retired civil engineer who specialized in land surveying and water rights, a man who now has entirely too much time on his hands, is a spectacularly bad idea. Drop a comment below telling me where you're tuning in from, because the tale of our esteemed Homeowners Association president, a woman we'll call Brenda McEntitled for reasons that will become painfully obvious, is one for the books. She genuinely believed, in whatever alternate reality she occupied, that she could unilaterally decide to run a water pipeline straight through the middle of my ranch, tap into my private spring, the very source of it, mind you, and provide free water to her meticulously manicured little kingdom of suburbanites. The cherry on top? When I, quite reasonably, turned off the unauthorized spigot on my own land, she had the nerve to call the sheriff on me. Spoiler alert, folks, that particular emergency call didn't pan out quite the way Brenda envisioned. Not by a long shot. My retirement plan was simple: peace, quiet, and the undisturbed enjoyment of the several hundred acres of rolling Texas hill country I'd worked my entire life to afford. My ranch, Serenity Springs, wasn't just a clever name. It was home to a natural artesian spring that had been documented on deeds going back to the 1800s. It was the lifeblood of my property, feeding a couple of stock ponds and providing all the water I needed. The back 40 of my land abutted a newer, rather upscale housing development, Whispering Pines Estates, governed by an HOA with a reputation for being enthusiastic. I mostly kept to myself, content with the rustling leaves and the distant moo of my neighbor's cattle for company. My days were spent tinkering in my workshop, reading, and occasionally walking my property lines, a habit ingrained from decades of survey. I know every marker, every fence post, every nuance of my land like the back of my hand. The first inkling that something was amiss came subtly, a faint, unfamiliar hum of machinery carried on the breeze when the wind was just right, a sound that didn't quite belong to the usual rural symphony. Then I noticed the water level in my main stock pond, the one directly fed by the overflow from the spring, seemed a tad lower than it should be for the season, even accounting for a dry spell. I'm meticulous about these things. I keep records. It was a fractional difference, easily dismissed, but it lodged a small pebble of unease in my mind. So, one crisp autumn morning, I decided to take a walk along the southern boundary, the one shared with Whispering Pines. It wasn't long before my unease blossomed into outright disbelief. About 50 yards inside my clearly marked fence line, a raw red gash had been sliced through the earth, a fresh trench, and nestled within it, a brand new 6-inch PVC pipe. My jaw, I imagine, was somewhere around my bootlaces. I followed the trench. It led directly from the protected alcove where my spring emerged from the limestone, ran arrow straight across a good quarter-mile of my pasture, and disappeared under the fence towards the HOA development. My initial reaction wasn't anger, not yet. It was a profound, almost disorienting sense of bewilderment. This wasn't a minor encroachment, a misplaced fence post. This was a significant, deliberate infrastructure project, undertaken with an astonishing level of trespass. I headed back to my office, a room lined with filing cabinets containing every deed, survey plat, and legal document pertaining to Serenity Springs. I pulled out the master survey, the one I'd personally verified when I bought the land. Unsurprisingly, there was no easement, no right-of-way, no hint of any shared water agreement with the Whispering Pines development. The spring, and the land it sat on, was unequivocally, entirely mine. I even had the original water rights filings from the state, confirming its status as a private source. Someone, it appeared, had made a monumental error. Or, a more cynical thought began to form, someone had made a monumental assumption. Deciding that a direct civil approach was the best first step, I cleaned myself up and drove over to the Whispering Pines Community Clubhouse, which also served as the HOA's command center. The place reeked of fresh paint and toy new money smell of engineered wood floors and oversized faux Tuscan furniture. I asked for the HOA president and was directed to a woman holding court by a coffee station. Brenda McEntitled. She was probably in her late 50s, immaculately turned out in what looked like designer yoga wear, despite it being midday on a Tuesday, her blonde hair sculpted into a helmet of immovable perfection. A large, chunky gold necklace that screamed, "Look at me," adorned her neck, and her expression was one of perpetual, slightly pained condescension, as if the world constantly failed to meet her exacting standards. When I introduced myself and explained, calmly and politely, that there appeared to be a new pipeline installed on my property, originating from my spring, she barely paused in pouring her herbal tea. "Oh, that," she said, waving a dismissive hand adorned with several large rings. "We're just doing a little bit of, drainage improvement for the community. Tidying things up, it benefits everyone, dear." She smiled, a tight, insincere little twitch of the lips. "Nothing for you to worry your little head about." The sheer audacity of it, the casual dismissal, the blatant lie, that's when the bewilderment began to morph into a slow-burning fuse of indignation. I was dear, and my little head shouldn't worry. This woman, who clearly wouldn't know a riparian right from a rites of spring, was gaslighting me about a major unauthorized excavation and water diversion on my land. I reiterated, still calmly, that it was unequivocally my property and my water source, and that no such work had been authorized. Her smile faltered, replaced by a flicker of annoyance. "Well, I'm sure it's all perfectly fine," she snapped, her voice acquiring a flinty edge. "The community needs reliable water, and we're ensuring that. Our engineers have handled everything." Her engineers? On my land without my knowledge or permission? The fuse shortened considerably. I told her I expected the work to cease immediately and the pipeline to be removed. She actually scoffed. "That's quite impossible. It's a community project. Now, if you'll excuse me, I have important HOA matters to attend to." And with that, she turned her back on me, a clear signal that, in her mind, the conversation was over. "Oh, Brenda," I thought, "you have no idea. You've just declared war on a man whose entire career was built on understanding lines on a map and the laws that govern them." This wasn't going to be a little worry. This was going to be her problem, a very, very big one. The drive back to my ranch was filled with a cold, methodical anger. Brenda McIntyre's dismissive attitude, her blatant disregard for property rights, her assumption that she could simply take what she wanted, it was breathtaking. But anger without action is just noise. My professional instincts, dormant during the early days of retirement, roared back to life. Phase 1, the civil inquiry, had failed spectacularly. Phase 2, meticulous documentation and legal fortification, was now underway. The first thing I did was retrieve my high-resolution drone from its case. Over the next few days, I conducted a series of aerial surveys, photographing and videoing the entire length of the offending pipeline. From its origin at my spring head to where it disappeared under the fence into Whispering Pines, I took GPS coordinates at multiple points. I documented the disruption to my land, the heavy equipment tracks, the excavated earth carelessly piled up. I also set up discrete, motion-activated trail cameras overlooking the spring and sections of the pipeline on my property. If anyone from the HOA or their contractors dared to venture back onto my land, I'd have them on candid camera. Next, I delved into my archives. I had copies of all the original plat maps for my property and the surrounding area, including the land that became Whispering Pines. I cross-referenced everything with the County Appraisal District's online GIS system and then took a trip down to the county clerk's office to pull the actual recorded plats and any declared easements for the Whispering Pines development. As I suspected, there was absolutely nothing granting them access to my land or my water. Their entire development plan, on file with the county, showed their water supply was supposed to come from a series of deep wells drilled on their own common land, or eventually, connection to the municipal utility district, which was still some miles away and would be costly. Brenda, it seemed, had opted for a cheaper, albeit entirely illegal, solution. Armed with this initial batch of evidence, I drafted a formal cease and desist letter. It was polite but firm, citing the specific parcel numbers, the nature of the trespass, the unauthorized appropriation of water resources, and a demand for the immediate cessation of any further work, the removal of the pipeline, and the remediation of my land within 14 days. I included copies of my deed, the relevant survey map highlighting the property lines and the spring's location squarely within my boundaries, and a few key aerial photos. I sent it via certified mail, return receipt requested, to Brenda McEntitled, President, Whispering Pines HOA, and a copy to the HOA's registered agent. The green return receipt card came back signed a few days later, then silence. For about a week, nothing. I continued my monitoring. The trail cams showed no new activity. Perhaps, I thought, they were actually taking it seriously. Perhaps they were consulting a competent lawyer who would explain to them the colossal blunder they'd made. I should have known better. Brenda McEntitled was not the type to admit error, especially not one of this magnitude. About 10 days after I sent the letter, I received a response. Not from Brenda directly, but from a law firm I'd never heard of, Dewey, Cheatham, Howe, or something equally uninspired. The letter was a masterpiece of obfuscation and barely veiled contempt. It was riddled with legal-sounding phrases like long-standing community understanding, implied easement by necessity, and public benefit doctrine, all of which were utter nonsense in this context. They claimed the HOA had a good faith belief they were acting within their rights to ensure water security for the residents. They vaguely alluded to conversations with the previous owner of my previous property, a man who'd been dead for 20 years and from whom I had a direct warranty deed with no such encumbrances mentioned. The letter concluded by stating the HOA considered the matter closed and would vigorously defend its right to maintain the vital community water infrastructure. It was clear Brenda had simply handed my detailed letter to the cheapest lawyer she could find, who then regurgitated her talking points into a poorly drafted response. She was doubling down. The audacity was almost impressive if it weren't so infuriating. Around this time, I also started hearing the distinct sound of water pumps running intermittently from the direction of the HOA. I checked my spring. The flow was definitely, measurably reduced. They hadn't just installed the pipe. They were now actively drawing water. My water. This escalation prompted me to reach out to a few people. First, my own lawyer, Ms. Eleanor Sharp. Ellie was a razor-sharp attorney, specializing in property and water law, known for her tenacity and her dislike of bullies. When I laid out the situation and showed her my documentation, her eyes lit up with a predatory gleam. "Frank," she said after reviewing everything, "this isn't just trespass, this is grand theft water if such a charge existed. The sheer arrogance is, well, it's going to make this fun." She confirmed my legal position was impregnable and advised me on the next steps. "Let them continue to operate it for a bit, Frank," she counseled. "Let them become dependent on it. Document their usage. The damages claim will be that much more significant. We're not just going to get that pipe removed, we're going to make them pay for every drop, plus your time, my time, and a healthy dollop for punitive damages." This HOA president sounds like a classic narcissist who thinks rules are for other people. Ellie's confidence was infectious and solidified my resolve. I also decided to do a little quiet recon within Whispering Pines itself. I had a casual acquaintance there, a fellow retiree named Tom, who was more of a grumbling, reluctant HOA member than a true believer. I met him for coffee in town and subtly brought up the topic of HOA projects. Tom grumbled about rising dues and Brenda's increasingly dictatorial style. When I carefully mentioned the new water line, Tom's eyebrows shot up. "Yeah, Brenda made a big announcement about securing a new independent water source for the community a few weeks back," he said. "Said it would save us a fortune on well maintenance and delay having to pay the exorbitant hookup fees for city water." She was very smug about it, took all the credit. Most folks just nodded along, happy to hear about savings. He then lowered his voice. "But Martha Henderson, who's lived here since the development first opened, told me she thought it was fishy. Said she remembered old man Weatherby, who owned your place before you, being real particular about his spring." Martha Henderson. That was a name to remember. Tom gave me her house number. A few days later, I paid a visit to Martha. She was a sprightly woman in her late 70s, with a keen mind and a no-nonsense attitude. When I explained who I was and why I was there, she invited me in immediately. "I knew it!" she exclaimed before I'd even finished my story. "I told my son," I said, "Brenda's gotten too big for her britches if she thinks she can just snatch water from the Weatherby spring. Old Man Weatherby would have had his shotgun out. Martha confirmed that there had never been any agreement, formal or informal, for the HOA to use water from my property. She'd been on the initial resident advisory committee when the development was being planned. They drilled 2 wells, she stated firmly. One went dry pretty quick, and the other one's always been unreliable, especially in summer. Brenda's been desperate for a solution that doesn't involve spending a fortune on the municipal connection or drilling more expensive wells. Looks like she found one, or so she thought. Martha was a godsend. She was willing to provide a sworn affidavit detailing her knowledge of the situation. She was also, it turned out, thoroughly fed up with Brenda's reign and was quietly supportive of anyone who might bring her down a peg. My file of evidence was growing, and so was my confidence. Brenda McIntyre thought she was being clever. She was, in fact, meticulously engineering her own downfall, and I was more than happy to help her lay the foundation. The water flowing through that illegal pipe wasn't just H2O. It was a ticking clock, and time was running out for her. With Miss Sharp's strategic advice echoing in my ears, "Let them hang themselves with their own rope, Frank, then we give it a good, firm tug," I moved into the next phase. Meticulous preparation for the inevitable shutdown. The goal wasn't just to reclaim my water, but to do so in a way that was legally unimpeachable and would leave Brenda McIntyre with absolutely no wiggle room. First, I continued to document the HOA's water usage. I installed a discrete flow meter temporarily, and still on my side of the fence, of course, on the section of pipe near my spring, just to get an idea of the volume they were pulling. The numbers were significant, especially during peak daylight hours, when landscaping irrigation systems in Whispering Pines were likely running. Every gallon they took was another entry on the damages ledger Ellie Sharp was mentally compiling. I also kept detailed logs, noting when I heard their pumps operating, cross-referencing it with the flow meter data and the visible drawdown at my spring. My dossier was becoming impressively thick. Surveys, deeds, county records, aerial and ground photography, video footage, copies of all correspondence, Martha Henderson's sworn affidavit, Resigit Tudave in Nordy Fortage Nordy. And now, water usage logs. It was a fortress of facts. The critical piece of my plan involved installing a master shutoff valve on the pipeline. This had to be done on my property, upstream from where the pipe crossed the boundary fence, and it had to look entirely like a legitimate upgrade to my own water management system. I wasn't just going to crimp the pipe. I was going to install a heavy-duty, industrial, quality ball valve, complete with a lockable handle. I called up an old friend, Jerry, a licensed master plumber I'd known for 30 years, a man whose discretion was as legendary as his skill with a wrench. I explained the situation. Jerry, a fellow property rights enthusiast, found the whole thing both appalling and darkly amusing. He agreed to do the installation, officially permitted as an agricultural irrigation system upgrade on my property. We scheduled the work for a weekday morning when most Whispering Pines residents would be at work or otherwise occupied. Jerry arrived with his truck. We put up a temporary men working sign near my access gate, far from the HOA's prying eyes, and he got to it. The installation was flawless. The new valve was situated in a neatly dug gravel-lined pit, easily accessible, but not immediately obvious to a casual observer from a distance. It looked for all the world like a professional, permanent fixture intended for managing my own water. Once Jerry was done and packed up, I placed a heavy-duty padlock on the valve handle, ensuring it was firmly in the off position. The illegal tap was now, officially, closed. The next step was choosing the opportune moment to actually, definitively, turn off their illicit supply. Miss Sharp had advised waiting for a period when they'd be most reliant on it, to maximize the impact and highlight their dependency. The local weather forecast provided the perfect cue. A late-season heat wave was predicted for the following week, with temperatures soaring into the high 90s. Perfect. Lawns would be thirsty, pools would need topping off, and Brenda's independent water source would be more critical than ever. I waited until the second day of the heat wave. I could hear the distant, almost constant hum of their pumps. They were gulping down my spring water at an impressive rate. Mid-morning, when the sun was already beating down, I took a quiet stroll out to my new valve installation. With a deep sense of grim satisfaction and a silent apology to the actual spring itself for the abuse it had endured, I turned the lever a full 90 degrees. The flow through the pipe ceased with a barely audible sigh. Then, silence. A beautiful, satisfying silence. Back at my house, I settled onto my porch with a tall glass of iced tea made with my own untainted spring water and waited. It didn't take long. Perhaps 2 hours later, I heard the first faint sounds of consternation drifting over from Whispering Pines. A lawnmower sputtered out not to restart. Then a raised voice, carrying on the hot, still air, someone clearly unhappy. I imagined the scene, sprinklers dying mid-arc, showers dwindling to a trickle, toilets refusing to refill. The carefully cultivated green lawns of Whispering Pines were about to get very, very thirsty. My trail cam overlooking the fence line showed a figure, likely an HOA contracted landscaper or handyman, peering towards my property with a puzzled expression a little while later. He made a call on his cell phone. I could almost hear Brenda McEntitle's shriek of indignation from here. She would, true to form, assume a simple mechanical failure. She'd dispatch someone to fix it. They'd trace the line back, find it dry, and eventually they would discover my new, very official-looking valve. They would report that the water was off at the source, on my property. And that, I knew, was when Brenda's infamous temper, coupled with her staggering sense of entitlement, would lead her to make her biggest mistake yet. She wouldn't call me. She wouldn't call her lawyer, who probably would have advised caution, even that dim bulb. No, Brenda would see this as sabotage, an attack on her authority and her precious community. She would call the authorities, painting herself as the victim and me as the villain, and that was precisely what I was counting on. The trap was set. All that was left was for the quarry to walk into it. The late afternoon sun was beginning to dip towards the horizon, painting the sky in hues of orange and purple, when the distant but distinct sound of sirens reached my ears. One, then two. They were getting closer. I took a slow sip of my tea. Showtime. I remained on my porch, calm and collected, my meticulously organized binder of evidence resting on the small table beside my rocking chair. Sure enough, 2 county sheriff's department SUVs, lights still flashing, pulled to a stop at the main gate of Whispering Pines. I watched through my binoculars as Brenda McEntittle, looking flustered and furious in a vibrant pink tracksuit that did her no favors in the sweltering heat, practically bounded out to meet them. She was animated, gesticulating wildly, pointing dramatically in the direction of my ranch. I could only imagine the torrent of accusations she was leveling against me. Destruction of HOA property, denial of essential services, malicious mischief, probably even eco-terrorism given her flair for the dramatic. She was playing the role of the aggrieved community leader to the hilt. After several minutes of this performance, one of the SUVs, carrying 2 deputies, detached from the confab and drove slowly down the road towards my property entrance. They parked just outside my gate. 2 deputies emerged, a senior, weather-beaten officer with a no-nonsense air, Sergeant Miller, and a younger, more observant-looking deputy, Deputy Rodriguez. They approached my porch cautiously but professionally. I rose to meet them. "Good afternoon, officers," I said, my voice even and calm. "Can I help you with something?" Sergeant Miller got straight to the point. "Sir, we've received a complaint from the HOA president over at Whispering Pines, a Miss Brenda McEntittle. She alleges that you've deliberately shut off their water supply and are damaging their infrastructure." I nodded slowly. "Ah, yes, Ms. McEntittle. I imagine she's quite upset. There seems to be a significant misunderstanding on her part, officers. Perhaps you'd like to step onto the porch, out of the sun. I believe I can clarify the situation for you." I gestured to the chairs. They exchanged a quick glance, then accepted. This was already a departure from the belligerent old coot they might have been expecting based on Brenda's tirade. Once they were seated, I began. "Officers, to be very clear, the pipeline and the water source in question are entirely on my private property, Serenity Springs Ranch. Ms. Plost McEntittle and the Whispering Pines HOA installed that pipeline across my land and tapped into my private spring without my knowledge, without my permission, and without any legal right or easement whatsoever." I then reached for my binder. "I understand this might sound like a simple property dispute, but I assure you, the documentation is quite clear." I opened the binder to the first page, a large color-coded survey plat of my ranch, with the spring and the illegal pipeline clearly marked well within my boundaries. I then showed them my warranty deed, the county tax maps, and my official state water rights certificate for the spring. As you can see, I explained, I am the sole owner of this land and this water source. The HOA has, in effect, been trespassing and stealing my water. I then presented copies of the cease and desist letter I had sent, the dismissive response from the HOA's attorney, and even Martha Henderson's affidavit. I showed them photographs of the pipeline construction on my land. Finally, I explained, this morning, I simply turned off an unauthorized connection to my private water system on my own property using a legally installed valve. I have every right to control access to my own resources, especially when they are being taken illegally. I offered them Ms. Blanked Sharp's business card. My attorney, Ms. Eleanor Sharp, is fully briefed on this situation and can corroborate all these facts. The deputies listened intently, their expressions shifting from neutral skepticism to thoughtful consideration as they examined the documents. Deputy Rodriguez, in particular, seemed to be absorbing every detail, his eyes scanning the plats and legal papers. Sergeant Miller, a man who'd likely seen his share of bizarre neighbor disputes, asked a few pointed questions. Did you try to resolve this with them before shutting it off? Yes, sir, as evidenced by the certified letter and their lawyer's response rejecting my claims. Are you aware of the impact this has on the residents over there? I am sympathetic to the residents, officer, but they are being misled by their HOA president. The responsibility for providing them with a legal water source lies with the HOA, not with me through theft of my private resources. My answers were factual, unemotional, and backed by the paperwork in front of them. A stark contrast, I imagined, to Brenda's earlier histrionics. After about 20 minutes, Sergeant Miller nodded. All right, Mr. Henderson, I'd introduced myself properly. Thank you for your cooperation. We need to go speak with Ms. McEntittled again. They returned my binder and headed back to their vehicle. I watched them drive back towards the Whispering Pines entrance, where Brenda was no doubt pacing impatiently. The wait this time was longer. I could see the two deputies talking with Brenda again. Even from a distance, her body language screamed outrage. Her arms were waving, she was pointing, her head shaking vehemently. The deputies, however, seemed much less receptive this time. Eventually, the second SUV, which had remained with Brenda, pulled up alongside the first. There was more discussion. I saw Sergeant Miller make a call on his radio. This was it, the turning point. About 10 more minutes passed. Then, the unbelievable happened. I saw Deputy Rodriguez approach Brenda, who seemed to be mid-rant. The deputy spoke to her, and suddenly Brenda went very still. Then she erupted. I couldn't hear the words, but the fury was palpable. Sergeant Miller stepped forward, and then, clear as day, I saw Deputy Rodriguez take out a pair of handcuffs. Brenda McEntitled's jaw dropped. She started struggling, shouting, pointing at the deputies, then at my ranch, then back at herself as if to say, "Me? You're arresting me?" The deputies were firm but professional. Despite her protests and a last-ditch attempt to pull the "Do you know who I am?" card, which I could almost lip-read, they cuffed her. Her expensive pink tracksuit suddenly looked very out of place as she was guided, protesting loudly, towards the back of one of the patrol cars. The other HOA board members who had gathered looked on in stunned silence, their faces a mixture of disbelief and dawning horror. The door slammed shut on Brenda McEntittled, HOA president, now a guest of the county. The deputies then spent some time talking to the remaining visibly shaken board members before finally departing, one SUV taking Brenda with them. I allowed myself a small, satisfied smile. The trap hadn't just been sprung, it had snapped shut with a beautiful, resounding clang of justice. She had called the cops on me for turning off the water she was stealing, and in the end, they arrested her. The irony was delicious. The aftermath of Brenda McEntitled's very public arrest was, to put it mildly, spectacular. News travels fast in a small community, and news of an HOA president being hauled away in handcuffs for allegedly masterminding the theft of water from a neighboring ranch and then filing a false police report about it? That kind of story has legs, wings, and a rocket booster. By the next morning, it was the talk of the town, and certainly the only topic of conversation in Whispering Pines. My phone started ringing early, mostly local numbers I didn't recognize, but I let my answering machine screen them. Ms. Sharp, however, got an immediate answer. "Frank," she said, her voice brimming with amusement, "I've just had a rather frantic call from a Mr. Abernathy, who claims to be the vice president of the Whispering Pines HOA. He sounded like he was about to have a conniption. Apparently, Sergeant Miller suggested they contact you, or rather your lawyer, to discuss remediation and potential civil liabilities before the county attorney gets any more interested in the HOA's corporate culpability." She chuckled. "I believe the deputies laid out the situation quite clearly for Ms. McIntyre after they reviewed your evidence. Theft of utility services is a serious charge, especially on this scale, and filing a false police report is just icing on the cake for the prosecutor. Brenda apparently insisted you were the criminal. Didn't go over well when they had your deeds and surveys in hand." Brenda, as it turned out, spent a rather uncomfortable night in the county lockup before her flustered husband managed to arrange bail. The charges stuck: felony theft of service, given the volume of water and duration, and making a false report to law enforcement. Her expensive lawyer, hastily hired, was in for a tough fight against the mountain of evidence I'd provided, and the clear, concise report from Sergeant Miller and Deputy Rodriguez, who had been thoroughly impressed by my organized presentation and equally unimpressed by Brenda's histrionics and lack of any documentation. The HOA itself was thrown into utter chaos. With their president facing criminal charges and their independent water source now definitively and permanently offline, they were, to use a technical term, up a creek without a paddle, or in this case, water. The remaining board members, a collection of Brenda's enablers, and a few well-meaning but clueless individuals, were panicking. They faced not only the immediate water crisis but also the wrath of the residents, who were furious about being misled and now facing the prospect of huge costs to secure a legal water supply, not to mention the humiliation of their community being involved in such a scandal. Ms. Sharp, true to her word, initiated a robust civil action against the Whispering Pines HOA on my behalf. The claims included trespass, damage to property, the illegal trenching and installation, conversion, the unlawful taking of my water, and a demand for full remediation of my land, meaning the complete removal of their pipeline at their expense, plus significant monetary damages and all legal costs. The HOA's discount lawyer was swiftly replaced by a more competent and undoubtedly more expensive legal team who, after reviewing our claim and the associated evidence, quickly realized they had an unwinnable case. Negotiations began. They were, initially, still trying to bluster their way into some sort of continued access, perhaps a fair usage agreement. Sharp shut that down immediately. My client was offered no such courtesy when your client was stealing his water. She informed them coolly. The starting point for any discussion is the complete removal of all unauthorized infrastructure from his property and full compensation. The resolution took a few months of legal wrangling, but the outcome was never really in doubt. The HOA, under immense pressure from its residents and facing the stark reality of its legal exposure, capitulated. They agreed to pay for a specialized crew approved by me to professionally remove every inch of the pipeline from my land and restore the terrain to its original condition. They also paid a substantial six-figure settlement, covering the estimated value of the water taken, damages to my property, my considerable time and effort in documenting the theft, and all of Ms. Brostol Sharp's legal fees, with a nice little cherry on top for punitive damages, just as Ellie had predicted. Brenda McIntyre eventually pleaded no contest to a lesser misdemeanor charge for the false police report, conditioned on making a public apology, which I'm told was a masterclass in begrudging. Through-the-teeth insincerity and paying a hefty fine plus mandated community service, ironically, she was assigned to a local conservation group, probably counting tree rings or something equally galling for her. The theft of service charge was held in abeyance, pending successful completion of her probation and full restitution to the HOA for costs associated with her illegal scheme, which, I heard, was a significant sum they intended to recoup from her personally. Her reign as HOA president was, of course, over. She resigned in disgrace shortly after her arrest, and I heard she and her husband put their Whispering Pines house on the market not long after. As for Whispering Pines, they had to bite the bullet and pay the exorbitant fees to connect to the municipal water utility, a project that took the better part of a year and involved considerable expense and disruption for the residents. A new, much more humble and diligent HOA board was elected, their primary mandate being no more scandals and find us some legal water. My friend Martha Henderson even joined the new board for bringing a much-needed dose of common sense. Occasionally, the new HOA leadership would see me in town, and they'd give a polite, almost deferential nod. No one from Whispering Pines ever asked about my spring water again. My ranch, Serenity Springs, returned to its peaceful state. The spring flowed freely, my stock ponds were full, and the only lines on my land were the ones that belonged there. Looking back, it was an absurd amount of drama over something that should have been simple. But it was a potent reminder that property rights are only as strong as your willingness to defend them. Brenda McKen underestimated me. She saw an old man on a quiet ranch, not someone with the skills, the patience, and the sheer bloody-minded determination to see justice done. She learned, the hard way, that you can't just take what isn't yours, especially when it belongs to someone who knows exactly where the line is drawn. So, what do you think? Was Brenda the most brazen HOA Karen you've ever heard of? Or have you encountered someone who gives her a run for her money? Let me know your thoughts down in the comments. And hey, if you enjoyed this little slice of rural justice, make sure to hit that like button and subscribe, because around here, you just never know when the next wild story is going to break.